Welcome back to McCarthy Performance. Today I'm going to attempt to try and explain bearing clearances and how to measure them, how I measure them, and when things go wrong and how to check them. So what we're going to do is I'm having problems with bearings again. Surprise, surprise. It's not surprising to me. It's might be surprising to you. You might learn something, or you may not. Bearings lately have been horrible. Bearings are coming from places that the quality control, let's say, is maybe slipped or never was really that good in the first place. I will show you what you have for clearances and sizes, and we'll go from there. I've got a piece of paper. Obviously there's books, bearing books, that'll give you the housing board dimension, the bearing sizes, and the shaft sizes. We'll try to make it straightforward. We'll see how it goes. I didn't want to get into doing this, but I feel that it's probably worth maybe some people that don't know, maybe it'll open their eyes up and see what it is getting to be in this business. Is just trying to simply put something together, and it's such an uphill fight with quality control. It's horrible. It's been bad, but it's not getting any better, unfortunately. And like I've said before, that's why it pays to have good measuring equipment. The days of plastic gauge, if that's all you got, it's better than nothing. But I'm telling you, if you don't have a dial bore gauge and it doesn't read in tenths or at least half thousandths, you're shooting in the dark on this stuff. It's just, things are getting bad. It doesn't matter if it's a race engine or an OEM stock engine like this. And we'll get into it and I'll show you. Now, this I-line board, this block. This block is, the line bore is within a couple tenths of a thousandths, maybe 2/10 of a thousandths. To the low end of the spec, and I'll explain that later. I don't want to get it here, but I'll explain it to you. But I will show you what I've got going on position 5. Now, we'll have to back up a little bit, but I'm going to put my dial bore gauge in here, and I want you to look at the dial bore gauge very closely to what the gauge says. I'll get you in a position where hopefully you can see the dial bore gauge. That hopefully is a good position. I'll probably have to roll the engine back a little ways so you can see the gauge, the dial bore gauge. Well, this is set up. Basically, on shaft sizes and housing bores, they usually give you a thousandths. That's what the tolerance is. Okay, I'm on the small end of the housing tolerance, tight. Probably can't see it. Maybe you can see it now. Hopefully you can. Okay, that says 0 right there. I'm at the end of the cap, or the front of the cap, excuse me. Now I'm going to measure the end of it. Now, this is the flange bearing, this is the thrust bearing. It's wider on Chevys, okay? So we're at 0. I'm going to retract the gauge, I'm going to slide it into the bore. If you look at it, I'm a tenth under, maybe a half a tenth, because it ain't quite reading a tenth. But for sake of argument, 1/10 of 1/1000th of an inch. That means from this face of the bearing, move it forward here, this face of the bearing, the front part of the bearing, to the back part of the bearing bore, there's less than 2/10, 1/10 of taper. Okay, remember that. 1/10 of one on the taper. Now I've checked these. They're all about the same. So I'm going to break this cap off, take it off, and put the bearing in it. I'm going to torque it up. I've got to reset this to the size of the crank journal as it was ground. Have that bearing in the housing bore. I have it torqued up. It's not binding. There's nothing that's affecting the clearance. Everything looks good, clear. When you line bore them, sometimes you got to make sure that there's enough relief here. That's not what's going on here. I'll back up a little bit. When I measured it the first time, of course it was torqued up. I didn't say it was torqued up. It was. So, the only thing we can do now is check this, and I'm going to show you what's going on with this bearing to prove to you that it isn't in the machining, it's in the bearing itself. Now remember, there was 1/10 of 1/1000th variation on the housing bore. Now, I have a piece of paper here that it was easier for me to take and write it down to show you. We'll go over that. But for number 5, right there, number 5, we have 6/10, which is 1/10 over 1/1000 for people that don't know, to 3.6. That is 3 and a little bit more than 1/1000 by 1/10. So basically they're giving you 3/1000 variation. That's how loose that clearance can be. Now, we can talk about racing engines and we can talk about clearances, but getting back to an OEM engine, what would be my acceptable clearance on this? Well, 6 is a little tight for me. If it was 1.5 to 2.5, I'd be okay with that. Now, if you look through our sheet here, and I don't want to get too far ahead here, but this is the acceptable range of the crank. Basically, you have 1/1000s, if you can see that. Basically, you have 1/1000s. This would be on the small end of the crank. This would be on the large end. Okay. Now, because it's cut 20/1000s, this is the size that it is. But if you add 20 to it, we're basically 3 to 4/10 away from the large end of the spec. 3/10 don't necessarily always equal clearance, but it pretty damn well does most 99% of the time. So we have a tight housing bore, which means it's going to grab the bearing and squeeze it a little bit more. And I'm 2/10 under the tightest end of the spec. I hope this doesn't get too crazy. But if you look at this number here, that's 6/10. This is the small end of the housing bore. This is the small end of the housing bore minus 2/10 of 1/1000. So where should we be with oil clearance? Well, I would think that we should be around 2 2.5, if the bearings are within size, because this is coming out of the bearing manufacturing book, although this is not the manufacturer of these bearings, but basically, give or take a half a thousand, you should be pretty darn close. Now, these bearings are Engine Pro bearings. I'm not going to get into that right now. I just want to try to cover this for you. Usually with a crank, you've got a thousandths room, and on a housing board, you have a thousandths worth of room. You can see that. So, normally we grind them to size, but I didn't think this was going to be that big of a deal. And it won't be. I'll just have to get some different bearings. Letting the cat out of the bag a little early, but I want to show you just how bad things can be and how this job sometimes just really wears on somebody when I try to do the best job I can, and I do most of the time. Okay, we'll save that for another day. I'll try to get you in here. Okay, the gauge is set for 0. It's not even reading anything. That means it's over 4 thousandths. It's not reading nothing. Okay, the crank is on the small end of the size. Everything is set up right. This ain't even reading. That's how bad it is. So I'll reset the gauge and see just how far off that is. But mostly, I guess I'll save you for the aggravation. All these are all over the map. They are at the biggest end of the spec. Now, that wouldn't be such a big deal if this is a race engine. This is definitely not a race engine. Wouldn't be such a bad deal if they had a high volume pump, although that back when I wouldn't particularly care for it, that's awful loose, even though it is a flange bearing and they will accept a little more clearance. There is no high volume pump for a 1957 Chevrolet. It's not the same as a standard Chevrolet small block pump. It's a different pump. It's an early pump. It's a different animal. I don't want to run a high volume oil pump. If I don't need to run a high volume oil pump in an engine, a stock to mild engine, I won't. High volume oil pumps do nothing but wear out distributor gears and take power to run them. There's no advantage of it. We'll save the oil pumping up to the top of the engine for another day with a stock oil pan. Okay. If you talk to Melling, they say don't do that. If you talk to most everybody on the internet, it says it does. I don't believe in any more oil pressure. That's resistance. So basically, you run it up against the wall. The harder you hit the wall, the more oil pressure you have. Oil pressure is not the answer for everything, although at a certain point in time it does come into reality. But for something like this, we don't want a high volume oil pump in it, but we also don't want to see no oil pressure. And I don't like the idea of rebuilding an engine and spending the time and have everything ground and all my machine work as good as I can possibly make it to basically be putting together a wore out engine, because when you put them together with loose clearances like this, you're basically putting together a wore out engine. On race stuff, you got to run it a little bit looser. I'm not going to get into that and my ideas on that. I've been doing this for quite a long time, and I have my personal views on this stuff, and there's a lot of guys that have the same view as I do. I learned from a lot of people that were older than me, and some of that still applies. Okay, so I set my dial board gauge, reset it, and I put 5 thousandths worth of preload on it. That means that I should be able to read this as it gets bigger. So we'll see. We'll see how far out of whack that back bearing is. Okay, so I'm at 4.5. 4 3/10. 4 3/10 up on the front. Remember, there was less than 1/10 of 1/1000th of clearance variation between here and there, not a thousandth. Okay, now at the back, we're at 3.5. 3.5. 4.5. That's a thousandth, 1/1000th of an inch. Across the bearing housing, there's less than 1/10 of 1/1000th on my housing bore. Let's do this again. Let's make sure you can see it. That's how screwed up this crap is getting to be. Let's do it again. Make sure there's no junk under anything. Everything's good and clean. Say 4 4/10 for if you want to get picky. Nope. Yeah. 4 3/10. 4 3/10 right there. This housing is 4 3/10 all the way to the back of the bearing. 3 3/10. So whole thousandths with a taper on that back bearing. And I had these bearings torqued up and I had checked all my sizes. There was one bearing that was good, acceptable. That was this one. The other ones completely sucked. You know, we can get into this maybe even further and you'd fall asleep. But what I'm trying to tell you is you got to check all this stuff. And it don't matter how good a machine work you've done. Doesn't matter how good a machine shop you have. Do your work if you don't do it. Has done. It all boils down to the bearings and clearances now. You know, there's a lot of things you can say about this. Imagine if the crank was on the small end of the spec, which the crank is not, but let's say it was, and say these housing boards were bigger, which they're not. You'd have 5/1000ths on the back. All these clearances would be at 4. So I guess that's what I'm trying to say. I'll back up a little bit on the measuring. I can measure the actual bearing shells, but I feel that this is good for just checking them really quick. But ultimately, when they're in the housing bore and we're measuring off the crankshaft, that's kind of how I go about this. But yeah, I do have a ball mic. I occasionally use it. Getting back to the housing bore, I said this was within under 1/10 of a thousandths. It is 1/10 of 1/1000ths from here to there. The haters can hate as much as they want. That's the reality of it. It's not quite 2, you know, but it's at least it's a full 1/10 of 1/1000ths. Usually when I do machine work, I like to try to shoot for 2/10 of a thousandths on most things. Like I've said before, a deck, I don't get too excited about that. If we can get them within a 0.5 thousandths to a thousandths, that's plenty close enough on a deck. But as far as piston bores and running clearances, that's why I have gauges. And both of my gauges read in tenths. And of course, how you set them up is going to give you a little bit of fudge factor, you know, within a couple tenths one way or the other. But, you know, that's where I like to be at. Okay, so now we're going to check the rods. Now, I machined these rods and reconditioned them. That's actually factory. That's how coarse they, like I said before, these things ain't Rolex watches. They slam them together. So, yeah, that ain't going to hurt nothing. But anyways, we're going to measure the housing bore. And we have a bearing in here, and we're going to measure this oil clearance off of the journal size. We set the mic off the journal. I set the dial bore gauge off my mic. That's how I do it. That's how I always have done it. So if the haters want to hate and they got another way and they want to roast me, that's great. Some of these guys get online and they just really like to tell me how much I don't know. And I just love them. So you guys just keep on doing that because you're just wasting your time. But anyhow, this is all set up for the rod. It's kind of tight back here, but I'm going to set it up and we're going to check one of my rods. Then we're going to check another rod that I have torqued up with the bearing in it and see what we have for clearance. Okay, so I got my Sonnen AG300 set up. And we have it set up for the mic. I set it off the mic. Probably can't read it very well, but we are at this tolerance here. Small end of the bore. Spec. So we're going to set up off. The dial indicator is already set up. So we're 1/10 of a thousandths off. I'm going to re-zero it. Try it again. We're at 0. Oh, we're at 0 right there. Check it again. Yeah, that's pretty darn close. Okay. Now, of course, when I reconditioned the rods, I had a target size in mind, and within a couple tenths one way or the other, I'm not going to lose any sleep over it. So we have a rod. They're all about the same. We're going to check it. Okay. I'm 0 to 1/10 under. So that means that this housing bore is at the tight end of the spec. I always like that. It holds the bearing into crush. It keeps the bearing from moving and fretting. Also transfers heat better. Most all the time, I'm going to set my housing bores for my mains and my rods at the tight end of the spec. Okay, now we're going to move over. We're going to reposition, and I'm going to measure one of my rods with a bearing in it. Matter of fact, we're going to use this one. I'm going to take the rod apart. I'm going to put a bearing in it. I already got a bearing in one. I'm going to measure the bearing clearance for these rods. So we have two rods with the Engine Pro bearings in them, made in China. Not that that's always a bad thing, but their bearings are junk. If you love them and you want to send me hate mail, go ahead. I don't really care. So let's, we're at, the crank is full, so that means the crank's big. And the housing bores are on the tight end of the spec, just like the mains. These are totally different than the mains. Okay, so let's check a couple here. I want to try not to gouge the shit out of them, but here we go. Okay, our clearance, they said we could get away with 6/10. So we're at 7/10 right there. They're not horrible, but I don't know. That one's within a couple tenths across the shell. And to be honest with you, Nobody's bearings are absolutely perfect. Okay, this one's reading the thousandths. This one's reading the thousandths, and then it goes to 6. So there's 4/10 worth of taper in them. Now, is that a lot? You know, everybody's bearings lately are coming in kind of goofy with taper, and I can prove to you that my housing bars don't have that much taper in them. If you want to tell me my housing bars got that much taper in them, that's fine. But I'll prove to you that they're not, and that's not the case. But I really don't want to have to prove that to you. Just take my word for it, if you will. The rod bearings aren't horrible. I mean, I could use them, but I'm not overly all impressed because why is my mains coming out so big? The tolerances are basically the same on both the rods and the mains. So that, I'm just showing you that. That's what we're doing. And as far as you might have heard me say something, I got a few haters that like to really go out of their way to criticize what I do. And I guess that's okay. You know, you have that option of doing that. You also have that option of not watching my videos. And, you know, if you're just going to watch them to pick them apart, I'm sure there's things you can find to pick them apart. I'm trying to show the people that want to learn something, at least something. Are you going to get 100%? Well, boy, I see a lot of videos on YouTube that the guys are just plain wrong. And you know, I'm not going to criticize them, you know. This takes a little bit of effort, even at a low scale operation like I do, to make these videos. So I said high volume, I said high pressure on the oil pumps. Well, them are two different animals. You can get high volume, high pressure. You also can take a high volume pump, which usually has bigger gears in it, like a big block LED8 type pump from GM. And you can change out the springs. You know, GM at one time I think made like 3-4 different springs. I had all that information because them pumps were made here in good old Bay City, and my stepfather worked for GM, so you know I know this stuff. So you know, sometimes I get lazy when I talk, and I guess we all can be accused of that once in a while. I'm not on here to be an ultimate teacher of everything. I hear guys that are professionals in this business. I'm a professional, that kind of screw up every once in a while. So you got to kind of give people a pass on stuff. You don't always have to fry them. You can always learn something from somebody. So, you know, I'm trying to be more professional. I'm trying to watch my words more carefully. But at the end of the day, we all get kind of lazy sometimes. So that's what I wanted to show you on this video. I hope you got something from it. Thank you for watching.